Welcome to another episode of AppSec Unlocked. I'm your host, Edwin Kwan, and today we have a fascinating topic to dive into, which is a fair approach to vulnerability patch prioritization. In this episode, we will explore how organizations can better prioritize vulnerabilities in their open source components using the FAIR model and EPSS. We're very lucky today because joining us is Denny Wan, who's an expert on fair analysis, who will share insights on this innovative approach. Denny, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good to speak with you again, Edwin. It's been a while since our last chat.
Yes, great to have you here, Denny. Let's start by setting a stage for our discussion. So organizations today are increasingly dependent on open source software, which comes with its own set of challenges. One significant issue is the sheer volume of known vulnerabilities. Many organizations find themselves overwhelmed, unable to patch all their vulnerabilities promptly. Traditionally, they have relied on system classifications like CVSS, which is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, and they use those ratings to determine which vulnerabilities to patch first, working your way from critical down to high, medium, and then low. The CVSS standard for this scoring uses several metrics that approximately determines the ease and the impact of an exploit. However, it is found that this method has been inadequate. There's been studies done, and it shows that only about 5% of known vulnerabilities are actually exploited in the wild. Despite this, organizations continue to struggle with prioritizing because CVSS does not do this effectively, especially in predicting likelihood of exploitation. This inefficiency leads to wasted resources and an increased risk. Now that we've set the stage, Denny, who's an authority on the FAIR analysis, is going to help us understand how we can address this issue. So Denny, let's start with the basics. Can you explain what FAIR is and how it relates to vulnerability management?
Yeah, Edwin, thank you for setting the scene and opportunity to speak with your audience. Now, FAIR, for those your audience who are not familiar with, it stands for Factor Analysis or Information Risk. The standard was created by a gentleman. His name is Jack Jones. Your audience might not be familiar with him. And he was a CISO at Nationwide Insurance in the US in the early 2000s. And he has also taken other CISO roles since then. And in early 2000, there was still very early on of the notion of cyber risk management. And so as you do, he go to the board and ask for budget to strengthen the cybersecurity protections. And rightfully so, one executive said, okay, Jack, you can have the money, is important. But what do we get for the money? If I give you the budget, how much risk would you reduce? Is it worth the money? And in fact, let's start with how much risk do we actually have? And Jack thought about it and said, look, well, reduce risk somehow. And yeah, we need to do it. And the secretary said, okay, well, what more can I say? Well, let's approve it. But Jack, as Jack is, he's not satisfied himself, right? And that's one of the problem is, you kind of question yourself and you're talking in the mirror. And he talked to himself in the mirror and said, Jack, you got to do better. You have to be able to measure cyber risk, but how? So he started thinking about this problem very deeply and fast forwarded, some 24 years. He created the FAIR standard, which published by the Open Group, and is a taxonomy and analysis method to measure, not to treat or mitigate cyber risk, just to measure risk. Because as often they say, you can only manage what you can measure. I mean, otherwise you're like walking around in the dark without a torch and you just fumbling around, you hopefully don't trip over, right? So you have to be able to measure how far you go and are you going in the right direction? Like you get out of the house in the fire for smoke. So this is what standard, and the first standard, as I mentioned, was published by the Open Group. First publication back in 2000 So it's some like 15 years ago. So it's been vetted by the global community as a really structured and consistent way to measure cyber risk. And once you have that measurement, you can engage different executive and business unit into prioritizing just investment, not technology. So FAIR is most useful in having an informed conversations and in managing investment. Now, investment, I would just close out on this point, is not limited just to financial investment. Often we thought about, well, we don't have a budget. That's very true. But in fact, the most common resistance is not the monetary budget, is process friction. And as a joke is, if you ask the business to have, triple copy of everything, and people are going to, roll their eyes and say, you can't be serious. We can't afford slow down the business. And the most ironic thing is, even in 2024, as we are, Australian federal government still had to remind people you must update the device and use MFA. And you might wonder yourself, what year are you talking about? Do we not have NFA? Like you waiting for the key fob to send to you, or your devices, your network is so slow you cannot afford to upgrade your devices. So this is a very serious matter, and it's not because of lack of capability, it's lack of willingness to practice the most basic of cyber hygiene. Hopefully that makes sense, Edwin.
Yes, no, it does. And thank you for that explanation. So I guess we got Jack and his um, desire to do better with cyber risk quantification. That gets us there now.
That's right.
So let's turn our attention to EPSS.
Mm.
So what is EPSS and how does this differ from traditional vulnerability scoring systems like CVSS?
Well, in fact, EPSS stand for Exploit Prediction Security Scoring. It's a security scoring system, and it is also developed by FIRST, which is the organization who developed CVSS. It's also security scoring. The difference is in the first two letters of the acronym. No surprise here. No guess. No no price guessing. So CVS, as you mentioned before, is common vulnerability, and EPSS stands for exploit protection, and it does not replace one another. It's not a better version of CVSS. What exploit protection aimed to do is, as you mentioned, that research shown only 5% of known vulnerability as classified CVE. Usually, most of them has a CVSS rating attached to it. Unfortunately, in the last like 10 months, a lot of CVE had no longer be classified with CVSS number, which is a bit of the problem. But putting that aside, so the exploit prediction is trying to help to answer the question of all this vulnerability, which 5%? Okay, there's 5%. Which 5%? And if I know, I would probably apply those patches first, because those are the 5% that are known, and I emphasize known, to have been exploited. And EPSS specifically is looking at the 30 days historical window by collecting attack data from sensors around the world in the research partner they work with at first to identify which of those CVEs in the last 30 days and the rolling 30 days has been actually exploited, but didn't know whether it was successful. But that is in itself is a really starting point, because you can look at that and help your own prioritization decision process to determine which of those known exploited vulnerability are applicable to your asset. Because they are not asset specific, they just look at all attack patterns in the world. Then you can filter that against your own scan results and said, okay, this subset is applicable to our asset base, so we probably should look at the feasibility prioritizing those applications.
Okay, that's really interesting. So it gives you that 5% of vulnerabilities that are exploitable based on the sensor data from the last 30 days.
Only 30
So,
days. Yeah.
so interesting. So how can organizations integrate both EPSS and FAIR to improve their vulnerability prioritization process?
Okay, well, thanks for the question. So I'm concerned that this acronym can be confusing even to risk practitioner like a cyber expert like ourselves, and of course we had covered a little bit about FAIR and EPSS. Most are familiar with CVSS, but these are quite new terms. So maybe if I can, please tolerate me to use an analogy, and I would like to use a very common physical analogy of border protection. It's a hot topic, right? This year and government or persuasion in Australia, emphasis as emphasizing on being strong on the border. And of course, they're not talking about people flying from on planes. They're worried about people coming by boats, right? And there's there's another interpretation why the differences. And you talk about the 5% vulnerability as based on research on CVSS, and which is underpinned the EPSS algorithm. The analogy would be these like all shoreline are vulnerable, and of course you got perhaps security posts with people with binoculars, drones, and all that, as they do on the Northern Territory to watch for boats coming into Australian territorial water. And it makes sense, but it was somewhat silly if you were to say that apply the same level of protection. Done it whole body. It's like, come on, guys, you got better things to do, right? Yeah. And so you will really focus on, I would say, less than 1% of the Australian coastline with just a lot of protection, even with over horizon radar and all that technology to scan for potential boats coming into Australian territory water. The coverage is still very small along the coastline. I would say much less than 5%, but that's effective, right? They do pick up the those entry boats. And another component that you haven't mentioned just as yet, and a lot of your audience are probably very familiar if they want to be management space, is the MITRE TTP framework. That is not looking at vulnerability by attack path or queue chains, right? And of course, the vulnerability enable those because some of the queue chains exploit vulnerabilities. But a lot of vulnerability as a very similar category as at least classified by MITRE TTP. And so you can look at that bunch of vulnerability and said, if this is a TPP we worry about, then we need to strengthen those regardless of the EPSS scoring or CVSS, right? So MITRE TTP give you a complete different view to operationalize your defense. So at this point, I want to expand my analogy of the border protection from petrol boats and security posts at Northern Territory. As you would know, that during World War II, the Japanese had sent a submarine not to Darwin as they did the bomb Darwin, but to Sydney. And they also, in fact, launched two midget submarines, one of which one was caught, the other actually got sunk and is still sitting at the bottom of Sydney Harbour somewhere. And so you could ask, why Sydney? Well, in fact, the better question to ask is, how did they catch them? Because if all the focus of defense was based in Darwin, which is they did got attacked by the Japanese through the air campaign, which is they did the right thing. They might not have invested in the ability to detect and caught those midget submarine. And of course, you can imagine if the midget submarine, take out a couple of boats in the Sydney Harbour, that would be create a hysteria across the country. Is this guy got us? Stay right in the center of our country and life at risk. So the Australian military, credit to them, has thought about the Sydney Harbour. Of course, we know the Southhead and Northhead with gun position, which were never used, never fired in anger. The major submarine was the only instant when the hostile action was detected and defended against. So this is equivalent of MITRE TPP. MITRE TPP is really the way cyber defender need to think about the attack path and focus resources in addition to, or in fact in parallel with, vulnerability prioritization. So those two go together. Hopefully that defense analogy make more sense is, and credit to the Australian Defense Department. They've done a good job and successfully defended Australia in World War II.
Oh, that's a great analogy. So obviously, like the border is huge,
Yeah.
it's quite vulnerable, and obviously using something like a EPSS equivalent for border protection, they determine where to attack or where to defend. But then they also use the MITRE TTP, which we'll put some links on that in the show notes so that our listeners can jump into there for more information. So that sounds really promising. But I imagine, like all great frameworks, there are challenges in implementing this approach.
Mm.
What are some obstacles organizations might face, and how can they overcome them?
Well, I think our own conversation demonstrated that the acronym, and I think unfortunately, we're in industry, we love our acronyms, right? CVSS, well, we might think is the a child's play, but it's not quite for our industry. And of course, we're showing the spending the work with FAIR and EPSS, and I think even caught your audience may somewhat surprised is what are these terms, and they will still might be scratching our head. So I think the communication, and that's why I use the border protection analogy, is how to improve the communication and demystify all these high tech terms. And sure, they're very specific and complex, but the way you consume those insights doesn't have to be. So, and ultimately, no defense strategy is foolproof, and therefore you had to bring people on board. And the Australian Defense Department have done a good job bringing the community along and the government along, and give them confidence, give us as citizens confidence. Our defense is strong, and so we had to do the same thing in cyber technology, because no matter what prioritize, you can always get surprised. Yeah, a surprise. And like Colony Partner is a great example. It's not there was 0 day. It was no 0 day. It was that we just didn't bother to do the basic hygiene and checking, unused account, and revoke them or protect them properly. So this is easier said than done. And that particular example is very telling, because it wasn't a technical challenge to protect an unused VPN account. But the most barrier is not in my backyard. Why should I spend my time to turn off the account? And someone else's problem, I didn't create an account. Well, someone have to. Well, whoever someone was no longer here, or they are here, they're not interested. So I think this is the biggest problem, and FAIR is really designed to address the communication gap. And you might recall when I mentioned early on, FAIR is to only designed to measure risk, so you know you're going the right way, and give confidence and maintain continuous support from your stakeholder, your business. You say, great job, keep going, and no, it's nothing perfect. And I mentioned, I emphasized that FAIR does not help your risk mitigation or analysis. And that's important because those standards are already there. So the major communication, particularly the business value of cyber defense, is what FAIR is for, and this is what I really help my community to practice.
That's very insightful. And I guess we in the cyber business, like you say, don't do ourselves any service with all these acronyms that are confusing. And like you're saying, it always comes down to communication, awareness,
Mm,
and stakeholder buy-in.
mm.
Um, Very insightful on that. So as we start to wrap up, I'm curious about the future. Do you see the field of vulnerability prioritization evolving in the coming years, especially in relation with using FAIR, EPSS, and the MITRE TTP?
Yeah, thank you for that the question. And I would just acknowledge that this very conversation you are facilitating, I had privilege to be in this conversation with you, is part of the communication program. Our conversation doesn't help anyone to build defense, but help them to really better articulate, why they're doing what they're doing, particularly in terms of prioritization. So prioritization is interesting because you're not doing things differently. You change the order in which you do it, just the order. Now the order matters because as everything's go, you always run out of time, right? So what you don't prioritize, chances it would never get done, right? So the prioritization conversation is as important, more important than the vulnerability management activities you actually perform, like scheduling, patching, upgrade, re-architecting as your expertise in secure architecture. And the prioritization really draw focus and give confidence. Now, vulnerability occurs, the way we talk about it is software vulnerability. And of course, you have been recently draw attention to software supply chain, SBOM, that's a vulnerability conversation. These are known. And of course, in 2024, I commit no sin talk about using a word. It's AI. So vulnerability going to look very different going forward because AI will change the landscape. So with AI, of course, you no longer need to exploit technical vulnerability in the software. They're still there and you can exploit them. It's much easier to exploit logical flaw by tricking people, right? And an analogy I would use and I would pause at this point is as a infrastructure person started with Checkpoint software, deploying firewall infrastructure. When I started in the industry, we focused on next generation firewall. This is stable firewall, Checkpoint patented it. And nowadays who cares? Like your $50 home router has stable firewall. And they are stable. They don't care anymore because people stop exploiting stable vulnerability in the firewall. They just come to port 8443 and attack application level. So therefore, everyone, including Checkpoint, now move on to this what is called layer 7 firewall, where application firewall. So, we had to, as a defender, we need to live our game and really understand. That's why I mentioned about the mighty TPP. It's got to beat the bad guys as their own game because they are no longer just looking at exploitable vulnerability. They're looking at exploit path, find the easiest path of least resistance. And please share the link on our recent FAIR conference of the collaboration between the FAIR Institute and Mighty Ingenuity on applying FAIR to the Mighty TPP, the ATT and Mighty AT and CK framework to help cyber defenders to prioritize the defense informed by this attack path.
Great. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I like what you said. It's about this framework or this approach. It's not about what needs to be done. It's about the order for which we need to do that. So that's really important.
Yeah.
Denny, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, your insights into using FAIR, EPSS, the MITRE TPP for vulnerability prioritization has been valuable. Those resources you're going to share with me, I'm going to put them in the show notes so that all our viewers can listen to that. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into AppSec Unlocked. I hope this episode has provided you with actionable insights to improve your organization's approach to vulnerability management. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a message. And until next time, stay secure. Thank you.
Thank you.